So on this last day of Condor Week, as we've done in many past in-person Condor Weeks, we invite researchers from UW-Madison's campus, where CHTC serves as the campus's large-scale research computing center, as a core center. And so you'll get to hear from researchers on our campus who have implemented high-throughput computing and HT Condor into their own work with great success, and hopefully helpful information and feedback for us. But first, I just wanted to give an overview of our resources, both for any researchers in the room, including Zoom, who are interested in learning more about CHTC, but also so that those of you who have traveled here, who operate your own Condor systems, can learn a bit more about how we talk about high throughput computing with our researchers and how we support their high throughput computing needs. So CHTC, as UW-Madison's core research computing center, supports a more than $1.5 billion research enterprise here. We provide large-scale computing to all these researchers, but I'll talk about how we have kind of a dynamic and collaborative research computing ecosystem that through Condor allows us to really integrate with other providers of research computing on campus, many of whom are operating Condor clusters that we support them in operating for themselves. And in total, we support over 350 million hours of computing on this campus through Condor and CHTC services, with over 1,000 users just coming to CHTC and accessing that computing capacity through our own access points. We've supported over 320 different research projects in the last year, and those are from more than 60 departments and units. And in fact, we need to add and update this map to indicate a few more buildings that correspond to those units on campus. And we start by approaching researchers in terms that make sense to them. We provide large-scale computing, not just high-throughput computing, but also high-performance computing, et cetera. But a lot of researchers may not even understand those terms. So we come to them with things like, if you are outgrowing your current computing capacity in any particular dimension, maybe you have large numbers of computations that are taking too long, amounts of data that you can't support on a laptop or a single desktop, large simulations. Maybe they end up needing more memory than is on a laptop or desktop, but to a researcher, that might just mean that things crash or don't run at all. Or if for any other reason, a researcher feels like they've outgrown the computing resources available to them, we want to engage with them and pull them in. And I'll talk in a little bit about our research facilitation team, the human interface to CHTC, which I lead. But when anybody first contacts CHTC to sign up for an account, that triggers an email to our facilitators who follow up to set up a meeting. So we meet with literally every researcher who has an account through CHTC to use computing on this campus. And if we haven't met with their faculty advisor before, we ask that person join too, so that we can even talk with that faculty advisor on perhaps a longer term scale about how computing might impact and really transform their work. We provide ongoing help, as most research computing centers would do, through online guides, email-based support. And then we also have twice weekly drop-in office hours that we moved to virtual when the pandemic hit. And so if you're interested in learning more, I'll show this slide again at the end, but you can go to our website, learn about our services, look at our documentation and other things that we've got listed there. But the way that we approach high throughput computing, again, is going back to terminology that researchers understand. Most often when people come to us, it's because things are taking too long to run on their computer. And that frequently is an opportunity to talk about high throughput computing. Otherwise, people who might need to run large physics-based simulations typically know that coming in. But even so, some people coming to us who've been using internal parallelism on their computing systems that they currently have could be using a high throughput computing approach instead. And we talked to them about how the fact that when things take too long on their computer, it's likely and frequently, although not always, the case that they've got large numbers of independent computations that are running one at a time. Or even if they're using some form of internal parallelism that they programmed through a Python or MATLAB loop or an R, they're still only able to use the number of processors on a single computer in that typical case with those types of programming languages. And so we talk about the difference between serial execution, running things one at a time, versus speeding things up with parallelism. And that there are different types of parallelism, where if their computational work can be executed as numerous independent computations, each with their own input or parameters, an output that could later all be combined, that they could use a high throughput computing approach. And that would mean that each of these tasks could run on separate computers, even individual cores, allowing them on a large shared system to access up to hundreds or thousands of cores concurrently and very rapidly after submitting to the queue. And we compare that with what that researcher could get by not just continuing to run things that they in the way that they already do, but if they were to continue with, say, an internal parallelism approach that they may not need if their work really breaks up in a high throughput way. We love using the world's largest cake as an analogy, whereby the world's largest cake, a record set for the Las Vegas Centennial in 2005, was made not by building a really large oven or a really huge supercomputer, a single large system, but by using regular run-of-the-mill ovens and providing people with ingredients and recipes, and then assembling those all into a cake later. The same principles apply with high throughput computing, where each job, if you think of that as producing sort of one of these smaller cakes, can be run on a separate computer without coordinating with any of the others. Whereas with a large supercomputer or an internal parallelism approach, if one of the components, if one of the coils in a large oven were to break down, the production of the whole cake suffers and you have to start all over. So there are other aspects of that analogy that work out really well. But we also have in our toolkit, because we talk with so many researchers when they first get accounts, we know of lots and lots of examples and can even connect researchers with each other when they have use cases that we know are going to be really great candidates for high throughput computing. Things like text analysis, which at its core, most genomics is, parameter sweeps, multi-start simulations, other forms of statistical model optimization. You heard yesterday that there are machine learning applications where there's a high throughput component of GPU or CPU-based machine learning methods. And then, especially in the medical sciences, we work with people or with satellite data who have lots of images or even sometimes videos, but where those can be broken down and processed sort of image by image or frame by frame. And so then we can talk about the amount of scale that's possible, not just in terms of core hours, et cetera, but in terms of how many medical images somebody can process if they adopt a high throughput computing approach, or how many genomes they can analyze. And in CHTC, a researcher logging into a CHTC access point is supported to run many different types of computing, all from that access point. We do have a separate HPC cluster that is our smaller system that's really just for large multi-node MPI simulations. But it's really a minority of our researchers and their work that necessitates that approach. In nearly all cases, a high throughput computing approach is much more scalable. And that's why our largest system is our high throughput system that even backfills our HPC cluster. And because we and other entities on campus use Condor, rather than trying to have centralized everything research computing on this campus, we can collaborate with other entities on campus, like the IceCube project, which supports an international research community on campus. We can all share computing resources through the wonderful capabilities that Condor provides us. So a researcher coming through a CHTC access point not only has access to CHTC's capacity, but to other pools on the UW grid just by activating a flag in their submit file. They can also access UW-Madison's OSG pool. And through the mechanisms that we've learned about on prior days in Condor Week, that same researcher can integrate allocations on national clusters through the NSF or through other federal funding agencies or national labs that they might have access to, given the nature of their work. To go along with this, while CHTC is not a provider of long-term data storage, there is a provider on campus. We provide ample temporary data storage so that researchers can easily bring data in, either prior to submitting jobs or as part of what Condor can do in transferring data. And so that they've got plenty of space, both within CHTC and the ability to move data in and out, again, in an automated way, or even just to stage it in our local file systems when that's necessary. And our facilitation strategy, beyond being proactive support, very personalized in that first meeting, follows a particular recipe. Beyond meeting with every potential new user, within each of those meetings, we ask progressively for details. What is your research area? We start to learn what terminology that researcher uses. How does computing fit in? What are your current bottlenecks? What would you like to be able to do? Why did you come to us? What is your pain point that we can help you address? By teaching you, enabling you to effectively integrate large-scale computing into your work. And then, did I skip a slide? No, okay. Then we communicate expectations, where we say, okay, you said that you can run, this many images on your laptop, but that takes so many days. If you learn to submit jobs to our large-scale computing system, which we'll teach you to do, and run things so that each of those images is a separate job running in a high throughput way, you could be running hundreds of those concurrently, complete tens of thousands of them in a day if each of those images takes an hour. And then we follow up with the personalized plan to achieve number 3. Frequently, that's an email follow-up, but it comes with personalized next steps, pointers to specific guides in our online documentation, rather than leaving the researcher to try to figure out and navigate which of those are going to be most important to helping them scale up and become more effective as fast as possible. And then we make ongoing support accessible, and we overemphasize our ability to help. We have drop-in office hours, email-based support. So we try to provide lots of different formats in addition to our online guides, where researchers can come back to us. And having met with them first, we've already established a relationship that is collaborative and sort of reduced any sort of social barriers that they might feel in asking for help. And this approach that we've been applying for nearly a decade now, and with research computing facilitators as a model that's been taken up more nationally even, we've not only increased the number of researchers, but the diversity of research that we can support. So for example, when CHTC was tapped to become the Core Research Computing Center around 2012, 2013, I was hired shortly after that as our first research computing facilitator. We had a second one hired in late 2014, that's Christina Cook, who you'll hear from a little bit later too, as she moderates our next session, and who also presented earlier this week. But sort of immediately, we were engaging researchers from the life sciences, engineering, social science, and all these other areas, whereas prior to that, the computing on this campus, the usage had been really dominated by the physical sciences. And then because we were meeting with people, and because we have a separate computing system for traditional HPC versus our high throughput computing system, we also have data and know which of our computing systems have been most useful and most important to these different research areas. For example, in the life sciences and social sciences, which have had huge growth in their uptake of large-scale computing, not just at this campus, the vast majority of their work they're running is best suited to our high-throughput computing system. And they can use that computing service in such a way that they are now competing with these other research domains in terms of how much computing they're accessing, which is somewhat unique versus other campuses where everybody's computing needs are often attempted to be satisfied with just a traditional HPC type computing system. And even in the physical sciences and engineering, on this campus, we're really driving for CHTC to provide centralized HPC computing. More than half of the compute usage they've had in that time was on our high throughput computing system. There was a lot of work they were doing on their laptops or desktops or single servers, or even using internal parallelism that scaled much better with a high throughput computing approach on our large scale high throughput computing system. And those trends have continued, especially with ongoing uptake and increased usage across the life sciences. You'll get to hear from some of the researchers on this campus who have implemented high throughput computing a little bit later. But just as some other examples, we work with a variety of researchers who work with local farmers in the state as part of the Wisconsin idea of bringing the research and expertise of the university out for broader impact on our community. And you'll get to hear a little bit later from Raphael about some machine learning work that he does with cattle farmers. Galen Franck presented at last year's Condor Week, if you can catch her presentation, on using high throughput computing in Condor for precision mental health. And we've done things like work with researchers in biomedical engineering who are helping surgeons simulate various scenarios for joint surgery so they know which ligaments to cut or which ones to repair based upon an injury. They do lots and lots of simulations of scenarios, even simulating how that person might walk after an injury or after a repair procedure. And then we partnered with the developers of the software they use that is used very commonly for these types of joint simulations, OpenSim, to make sure that OpenSim was available with recipes on the OSG and to provide a webinar to their users. And we've had other users of OpenSim taking on high throughput computing, learning to use Condor by running OpenSim on the OSG. So you'll get to hear some more research use cases. Feel free to check out past HT Condor weeks where we've had other presentations. And I'll leave you with this last slide on how to get access to CHTC or learn more about our resources for the campus research community. And with that, I'll take questions before we transition to hearing from some of our researchers. Thank you.